Howdy, all you delicious people. My Dead Ex, Season 1 on Netflix. So, I had combed through this show just because I like to bizarrely just continue to go on through a zombie concept. I don't know what it is lately. I just have a zombie thing going on right now. Every single time ending up reviewing something with zombies in it. It's just coincidence. I'm not going out of my way to do anything to try to find zombie stuff. It just is coincidence. Me just kind of scrolling through the wheel of social streaming services. So when ultimately going into this show, I would immediately mention that there are also other kind of different things that have had this kind of concept. Reasonably, we have it to where the concept of this show is ultimately we seemingly have a romantic entanglement that ultimately ends in someone ending up dying by what we were to assume to be an accident. We ultimately have it to where I've seen plenty of this kind of concept. You could ultimately look at My XX, or you could probably look at, I think, John C. Riley and the girl who had ultimately played the mom in the Child's Play remake. Like, they had done some like relationship movie, and I think that might be the XX. I don't know, but there had been a ton of like relationship deaths that ultimately have the person end up coming back. I think Eva Longoria ending up doing a movie where she had died and come back as a ghost to seemingly try and wreak havoc on her relationship or on her husband's new relationship and so on and so forth. Like, we had, I think, a couple of those movies going out simultaneously, I think around the same time. Uh, we also like had reasonably there was one movie that I remember where we had a kid who seemingly had come back from the dead, and I remember this movie from a really long time ago, and we had it to where this guy was otherwise trying to come back to life so he could date his girl for prom. I remember this, but there was a movie that was done such a long time ago, and we have it to where this guy is dreaming about ultimately him being while being a zombie. We find out that ultimately this guy had otherwise just started to start dropping like parts of his body, like dropping ears or dropping uh, limbs or even dropping his Johnson. That was the tail end of it, where ultimately we had it to where we had his wing completely just falling out of his pajama pants, and then ultimately we had it to where the zombie character woke up. Um, I don't remember that movie, but it was such a long time ago. It was like a like the whole thing was the zombie came back to date the girl at the prom, and everything worked out evidently. It's weird. It's a weird concept. So going into this show, I immediately just gone in my head to ultimately say like, you know what, this concept has been done to death, literally, because the concept is someone is dying to come back to life. So what do they do in this show? What do they do different in this show? Well, ultimately we have the two romantically entangled characters ultimately to be seemingly having a person being brought back by twin magic amulets, which I'm like, yeah, that seems like a just fresh off the bakery or fresh off the oven concept. Like, man, I don't know how many movies would go into the magical amulet angle. Like, we basically had the movie Hot Chick, where I think there was like a bracelet or something like that, where ultimately it switched people's bodies and stuff like that. So reasonably, when looking at it, like, we go into this show, and so ultimately we have it to where Charlie is to ultimately have a longtime friend named Ben. that in the end, ultimately, these two characters would both have amulets, these necklaces. And seemingly after the very long-winded amount of funeral and all kinds of things for Ben, we eventually have it to where Ben is seemingly to be brought back. And I'm kind of teeing up this show for a lot of people. He's ultimately brought back to not be able to go without 30 feet of said. So these two characters have to be 30 feet away from one another, or ultimately we'll have it to where Ben ultimately is starting to get like hurt, and or if prolongingly further away from Ben for long distance at times might ultimately kill Ben yet again. So, going into this, we eventually have it to where Charlie is to eventually end up with seemingly someone else other than Ben, and eventually I will get to that in spoilers, but that doesn't mean that Ben is completely 100% off the table for Charlie to ultimately maybe be won over by Ben in the end. So, to me, I thought that this show, in all brutal honesty, I have kind of seen a lot of zombie-esh like shows and a lot of zombie-esh like movies. When going into this one, I was thinking like, well, this could be nice for probably a young audience, like a really young audience that like isn't completely and utterly aware of any number of zombie-esh like things, and like this is probably lighter than some other kind of zombie stuff. If anything, there isn't much of like any kind of gore or anything along those lines. Um, Reasonably, we don't even have a zombie really being labeled to really be a zombie. We don't have it to where Ben is actually eating human flesh. Ultimately, he's just eating like a common person would, for the most part, that I've ever actually seen him actually eat on this show. We ultimately have it to where the thing that I did like is kind of like the flashback stuff, kind of really showing that there is a possibility from remembering a flashback that ultimately we could bring Charlie and Ben quite possibly back together or together in some aspects of this show. Ultimately, I was kind of maybe like there was stuff that I did quasi like about this show, but then there's this also like the negative side of this show as well. Uh, when going into it, the positive, it's kind of like a like the whole person being dead thing isn't like a huge ordeal. Really, we have it to where even like at some points we kind of have to reference old movies or old stuff that they would used to do, but they don't do anymore. Even to the point to where a scientist would even mention to you that, like, oh yeah, like if this were the '80s, we'd do this and this and this, but we don't do that kind of stuff anymore. Like, and ultimately, we have it to where seemingly Ben's character is kind of nostalgic for old-fashioned movies. So ultimately, we have to do old-fashioned esh like approaches at some point in this show. I thought really that the big problem that I have with this show is really like Ben is a character that absolutely nobody gives an F about. To be brutally honest, not even Charlie is looking at Ben twice, kind of thing. And so ultimately, we have this show kind of becoming like I Love You, Beth Cooper kind of thing, where we ultimately have it to where Ben is ultimately like a character that is quasi ballparkingly confessing his love to Charlie, and Charlie isn't really quite all that into Ben, and ultimately, in the end, maybe she will feel differently because why not? Kind of thing. Um, going into this show, the grievances, yeah, Ben is a irrelevant character, and he shouldn't be. He should be the most important character, and but he's basically a person that nobody even knew existed, which is sad. We ultimately have it to where nobody really cares that Ben is really dead, hence why it makes so much sense that they're going out of their way to do so many services for Ben at his school, at a normal funeral, and so on and so forth. Uh, Basically, having it to where ultimately Ben just putting on Ben just putting on a thing of makeup and a wig ultimately could easily make people completely forget that Ben ever even existed. That's how relevant that this character is to the story. So really within this show, I was immediately going into here and I'm like, well, are they gonna play it to where ultimately Ben is going to be otherwise in disguise the entire time, and they're never going to really go out in public with this, or are they going to go out in public with this, and then ultimately things are going to go horribly awry, and ultimately everybody's going to assume that ultimately Ben is going to start eating people, even though he won't? Are they going to consistently go to every single zombie joke that they can ultimately go into? Or is Ben going to ultimately claw somebody? Is it going to be a stereotypical, like, let's make fun of the zombie things to ultimately, like, showcase every little thing that Ben does? Ultimately won't turn anyone into a zombie. I think really when going further along into this show, there is some fun kind of things that they do, but then also for a guy who was getting really crapped on when he was alive, basically when he's a zombie, like he is a fairly popular person, but then eventually he is also a kind of a butt of a joke, or really just a person that is otherwise going to probably get with people that he would not have, or ultimately reasonably share uh, some things that he probably would have never would have as just normal Ben. Because when looking at it, I think that this is kind of in quasi in some way like the Michael J. Fox Teen Wolf kind of situation. Where ultimately you have it to where when Michael J. Fox's character was just normal basketball player, no one cared. But then all of a sudden he turned into a werewolf, and then all of a sudden everybody was like, like, let's get the blonde girl with the giant chest to ultimately throw herself at Werewolf Man, and yeah, that'll be interesting. And ultimately, we'll have Michael J. Fox's character just consistently werewolf guy all the time, and ultimately they're going to change the mascot to werewolf. And like that's what I was kind of expecting that this show would go into, like cater everything to this zombie, but they technically didn't, like they kind of went that route, but then again they kind of were pulled back a tiny bit on that, um, and ultimately they don't fully go through all the zombie jokes, which was great. So reasonably, I think that's all that I wanted to say about this show in a very cryptic like sense. It's probably easy to probably maybe break this down in spoiler like sense. Uh, but yeah, I just thought that this show, ultimately considering all of the other stuff that has ever been out there, I just kind of feel like it's a weaker than kind of way of approaching this. Uh, I think it's just kind of to appeal to a certain audience. When looking at it, I had just seen the movie Warm Bodies, and when just watching that and then coming into this, I was like, yeah, they're kind of really tailoring this to like a very uh, like teen kind of audience, or really just uh, kind of one of those kind of like reasonably like, oh, like their love will be eternal kind of things, and like I'm ultimately just like, okay, sure. So let's go into spoilers about this show. Let's ultimately break it down and ultimately go into now just reviewing this whole season. So let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time I'm going to spoil this show. So reasonably in this show, we have it to where there are flashbacks of Ben and Charlie. We're ultimately to have it to where Ben is just consistently swooning over Charlie, ultimately telling her how much that she means to him and all kinds of things. Ultimately, to the point of Ben giving Charlie a medallion when they're younger, and we ultimately have it to at some point when Ben, right before Ben ends up getting the dirty death, Ben ends up reminding Charlie about the medallion that he had gotten her, and we have it to where Ben had supposedly worn his every single day, where Charlie does not really care because Charlie does not really care about Ben. And in the end, Charlie is looking for other takers, looking to ultimately look at a guy named Luke because that's the guy that she likes, supposedly. He's the nice guy. So we end up having a tour. Ben is stubbornly just like, man, I'm really realizing that like Charlie isn't really into me, and so ultimately I have to prove my love by going on to some water tower of sorts and spraying onto the water tower or whatever, or I think it was like a water tower. I think it might have been either a sign or a water tower. Ultimately confessing his love to Charlie, and then we ultimately have it to where Ben is to uh, fall off of this thing to ultimately fall to his death. So we end up having it again where we have it to where Charlie is ultimately just going like, "Oh my God, Ben had died. Like he was actually my best friend, and so now I should wear his necklace. Now I should go to his funeral." Ultimately, talking about Ben and so on and so forth. So ultimately, they put this man in the dirt because ultimately it doesn't matter anyways because he'll come back from the dead. So they put this man in the dirt, and so ultimately we have it to where Charlie is to go on home and ultimately just be grieving about her best friend, and so ultimately we have Ben who ends up showing up at her house. Charlie ultimately ends up asking, like, hey, like, why is it that you are not at your own home? And Ben is ultimately just like, well, yeah, I don't know. Like I don't know. There was some calling or some reason for me to come back here, and so Charlie's a little baffled and confused why Ben is still alive, and it seems that numerous times over we have to hide Ben consistently from other people, or ultimately we have to have Ben uh, kind of doing the old fashioned, like, yeah, let's hide the body kind of thing. And so we end up consistently having it to where Ben is to ultimately be met by certain people, re-seen by Laurel, who is Charlie's mom, and we have it to where ultimately Ben is to just hide the part of his face, but ultimately we have it to where Laura ultimately says, "Oh, hey Ben," and then ultimately we have it to where Ben drops down, and then Laura's like, "Did I seriously just see Ben?" And Charlie's just like, "No, what are you talking about?" Like, yeah, I must be doing some Ambien or whatever. So we end up having also Ben bizarrely needing to completely 100% exorcist his head all the way around while he sleeps on some chair. And because ultimately we have it where Charlie eventually wakes up with ultimately seeing Charlie's head turned around, and Ben ultimately mentions that, oh hey, yeah, I guess I can do a lot of cool zombie stuff now. I'm like, yeah, he didn't really do much of any cool zombie stuff, but okay, the whole head turning around exorcist style thing I guess was a thing. we have it to where Charlie reasonably a lot of times like ultimately has to uh, kind of protect herself from Ben by like her seeing something, and so or him seeing something like ultimately like watching her sleep or anything like that. So ultimately Ben flips his head over anyways. So we end up having Ben bizarrely like pulling off the warm bodies thing to where ultimately we have to have Ben be putting on makeup so he can look like a normal person of society. So we end up having it to where Charlie is reinstating Ben back into school because ultimately they have to stay within 30 feet of one another. But Charlie has to go to school. And so ultimately we have it to where Ben just re enrolls in all of the classes that he was already re enrolled in and as someone else. And ultimately he has to completely put on a different name for everybody. And he has to put on a supposedly Jon Snow Game of Thrones wig, and ultimately I think put on glasses. I think, and that ultimately makes him a completely different person. It's Superman all over again because ultimately we have Ben who doesn't talk with an accent. He doesn't sound different. He ultimately doesn't say to anybody that ultimately Ben had a twin brother. None of that kind of garbage. Ultimately, he just comes in there, sounds the exact same as Ben, and ultimately everybody even had when Ben had gone to his Spanish class, ultimately everyone in the Spanish class has ultimately mentioned that they're like, yeah, like Ben was in this class, Ben Bloom. And so ultimately you have to speak in Spanish, ultimately to mention that nobody cared about Ben Bloom, and so on and so forth. How Ben was assuming that everyone in the class was going to mourn Ben Bloom, and nobody even knew that he existed, even though Ben points out exactly where he had sat previously in the class. Not mentioning he was Ben Bloom, by the way, but ultimately we find out that Ben ultimately sat in a corner of some class and no one cared. Basically, they thought he was invisible. I can understand what that means. And so ultimately, sucks to be you, Ben, but how many probably friends probably showed up at your funeral? Probably not a whole lot, sadly enough. So we end up having seemingly where Luke and Charlie are going to end up commingling together. It seems that Luke is ultimately looking at Charlie and going like, you know what, I think you're a really good artist. Like, how about you pitch some ideas uh for prom, like what we could possibly do for prom. And so we end up having Charlie going and texting or trying to get the phone number for Luke. And ultimately, we find out that supposedly there is some rule where you have to wait 26 hours before texting somebody. And ultimately, we have it to where Charlie and Ben are ultimately trying to figure out the backstory of where these necklaces were and how to figure them out. We end up having it to where Ben ends up going to a, let's just say, an adult bookstore and goes in there and he's not quite 18, but really he's just ultimately asking for information about the previous owner and the address of the previous owner, but then also he's asking him love advice too, the guy that is Dr. Love. And so ultimately we have it to where Ben is ultimately asking this guy advice, and ultimately Ben ends up leaving. So we end up having it to where Ben eventually does not tell Charlie that he had gotten information from the about the previous owner. He ultimately keeps it to himself so that way he can keep Charlie to himself because he realizes that seemingly Charlie and Luke are going to work out. So the more that Ben delays on resolving this whole zombie thing, will ultimately make it so to where to where Charlie's not going to end up with Luke, and Charlie's going to end up being stuck with Ben. So we have it to where Charlie is to put on a pitch for this whole arrangement and whatever and what have you of this prom. But before that, some things had gone down. So ultimately, we end up having Ben needing to desperately find some scrapbook from his mother's home, and so ultimately Charlie ends up trying to go and comfort Ben's mom, and ultimately we have it to where Ben is just sneaking around his own house to try to find the scrapbook, and also try to find a folder that has photos of women all over it. So we end up having it to where Ben ultimately is to go and need to be seemingly bottled away or kind of held away from Charlie while Luke and Charlie talk to one another. You ultimately have it to where Ren is seemingly Charlie's best friend, and Ren is to go and seemingly do a ton of offers to ultimately get a lot of deals to it gets to where Charlie gives Ren $20 and Ren goes and buys a thing of weed from somebody and hires this jock for something, and then ultimately asks the janitor for a key and all kinds of things. So we end up having it to where Charlie is ultimately talking to Luke, and Ben is ultimately stuck in some room in the school with Ren, who is ultimately now smoking a thing of weed. And so Ben and Ren ultimately go and smoke a thing of weed, ultimately to regale the fact that ultimately their names rhyme, which I thought was stupid. So, but if anything, weed! So, we go on to here, and eventually at some freaking point, we eventually spoil it out that eventually Ben is a zombie. Or that he is a dead person. Eventually we have it to where Ben is discovered that ultimately he is a dead person. And so we ultimately have it to where Ben cannot hide that he is dead anymore. Because at some point it seemed like there was a ton of times where ultimately Ben had to just conveniently do a lot of things to otherwise hide the fact that he is dead. So, going into here, we eventually have it to where Ben goes right off to go into a lab where ultimately Ben is thinking that ultimately they're going to dissect him and tear him apart and whatever and what have you. And ultimately this school is kind of like, oh my god, we have a zombie in our midst. Oh my god, this is a great opportunity. Bizarrely. They're not thinking get this man away from me. He could eat me. He could eat human flesh. Because ultimately that's the question everyone's asking. Well, have you seen him eat human flesh? And ultimately Charlie's like, well, no, I haven't really seen him eat much at all. The only thing that Ben actually had eaten was a cake to commemorate his death. Because we also have it to where seemingly the class is putting on some service for Ben with a severely blurry picture. And ultimately Ben complains that it's like, dude, they could have gotten my yearbook picture. And ultimately they're just like, well, no, they just got it from this picture where ultimately it looks severely blurry and you can't really tell it's him at all. Anyways, so we have it to where there is a service in this school for Ben, and it seems that the vice principal who is kicking this whole thing off doesn't know a lick of anything about Ben, and ultimately he is mentioning that, hey, yeah, off of Ben's records, his middle name is Michael. My middle name is Michael. What a coincidence. It's ultimately this is the most irrelevant talking about Ben that you've ever heard of in your life. And so we end up having it to where eventually that the janitor steps in and ultimately mentions how much he hates all of the students. But the only person that he actually didn't hate was Ben, because ultimately he was nice and this and that. And we ultimately have to where Ben is like, yeah, like I was actually nice to that guy. So we end up having it to where like this whole proceeding just kind of quickly goes by the wayside because nobody really like nothing really nobody really mattered, nobody really cared about this, sadly enough. So anyways, we have it to where Ben is to ultimately be revealed that he's a zombie, and so ultimately I kind of came back around to ultimately talk about the funeral proceedings. But anyway, so Ben zombied out. So ultimately we have it to where everybody's asking questions. It also seems that there is a police officer that is consistently following Officer Mitch Maloff, that is ultimately consistently following Ben around, so that way people can feel safe knowing that Ben ultimately will never bite anyone, and if he actually does, then ultimately the police officer will be there to kill Ben or whoever else that he needs to kill because zombie. So ultimately, we have it to where everyone is trying to understand how exactly Ben is a zombie, and Ben ultimately is like, well, technically I'm not a zombie. It's like, well, yeah, but you're back from the dead, so ultimately you're going to be a zombie no matter what. So ultimately, we have it to where Ben is to ultimately kind of connect with one kid who ultimately I believe is the name Mason, and we have it to where ultimately this kid had gotten a boner ultimately of hearing some story about, I think, uh, like Eleanor or something like that. Some kind of famous person. Ultimately, we had to where Mason had just gotten a boner just because. And so ultimately, for the rest of this guy's life, he had been called Eleanor for his entire life. And so we have a tour. Mason is going to Ben and ultimately mentioning that, like, yeah, like you're going to be called zombie now for the rest of your life, or for however long your afterlife is. And so we end up having a tour. Ben and Mason become really good friends, and we have a tour eventually. Charlie is ultimately seemingly throwing a party at some point, and it seems that we have it to where Luke is such a nice guy, and ultimately he goes to this party, and we have it to where Ben is ultimately trying to win Charlie over by doing this dance number, and we eventually have it to where Luke is realizing that Ben is really interested in Charlie, so Luke ends up telling Ben, it's like, well, hey, how about you ask Charlie out to the dance, and like that'll be okay. Because ultimately, Ben is ultimately telling Luke about how dreamy he looks and how like Ben can't smile the way Luke can, and all kinds of other things. And so Luke ultimately says, like, well, Ben, how about you go and ask Charlie out to the dance? And because what ends up happening is this dance turns into a zombie theme because of Ben being at this school now. Ultimately, anything that Charlie was to think about for her ideas were very fairy tale esque, and the entire rest of the school board or the rest of the students otherwise thought, like, you know what? Like, because they kept bringing up all kinds of questions about Ben being a zombie, ultimately mentioning some things that happened in his zombie movie that people didn't quite understand. And so ultimately, Luke being at this meeting was otherwise trying to tailor the questions to Charlie's ideas. Because ultimately they had just gone into thinking like, yeah, zombie prom, or whatever it ends up being, zombie dance. I don't know what it was. I don't know if it was a prom or a dance or a morper or whatever, but it is what it was. So we end up having it to where reasonably Luke is just kind of upset that ultimately they had went with the zombie idea and none of Charlie's ideas. Luke ultimately liked Charlie's ideas and ultimately was trying to figure out how to fit in any of the ideas that ultimately she had. Because we have it toward Charlie being frustrated about the whole zombie prom situation. We end up having it to where Charlie chucks all of her ideas in the garbage to where Luke ends up trying to sift them all out, which ultimately seems pathetic and weak and whatever that they ultimately say when ultimately he had ultimately when Luke had told Charlie that he had sifted those ideas out because ultimately he thought he could do something with them. So we end up having it to where everyone is excited about Ben being a zombie in the school, and they're trying to go out of their way to have people or have Ben be accepted by everyone. So zombie dance. So this guy had to die to basically have a themed dance being done for him and whatever. That's pretty effing sad. So you ultimately have it to where Ben is ultimately thinking that he is going to, like, hey, well, like, maybe I'm going to be a shoe-in for being prom king or whatever, or dance king or whatever. And we end up having Charlie tell him that ultimately the king and queen had already decided, and Ben ultimately hearing the results were ultimately just like, yeah, like, none of those people actually earned the right to be king or queen, but sure, I guess, whatever. So we end up having it to where we are to eventually go on into, and I'm pushing a lot of stuff here. I'm pushing just through a lot of just blah blah blah, a lot of dialogue that doesn't really matter at a lot of points in time. I was ultimately assuming that Ben was gonna end up with Ren, and I was gonna assume Charlie was gonna end up with Luke. Like I thought that that was kind of like a no-brainer to otherwise go with that kind of arrangement, but ultimately I guess it was just not meant to be. Ultimately, so going into this show, we have it to where these zombie dances to happen. So we end up having it to where ultimately Luke had talked to Charlie, and Charlie had said like, "Well, I kind of wanted to go with you to the dance," and we ultimately have Luke ultimately mentioning it's like, "Well, how about you just save one dance for me," kind of thing. And so ultimately we go to the dance, and it seems that Ben ultimately wants to do every single traditional, old-fashioned uh, movie move that you could possibly make. It seemed that Ben had tried to pull a ducky to try to like woo Charlie over, and that didn't work. We eventually have it to where Charlie is getting her makeup done to be more like a zombie, and so eventually we have it to where Charlie gets all of her dressed together and goes downstairs to where ultimately Ben ultimately has to pull the traditional thing off of ultimately having a girl go down the stairs, and Ben goes, "Whoa, wow." So we have it to where reasonably Ben ultimately has a gigantic list of traditional things that he has to do at a dance, spike the punch, do a dance montage, and a number of other things. And so we end up having it to where Ben is to go into this dance, and people are ultimately saying like, "Hey, dude, I look just like you. Isn't it great?" And Mason ultimately is saying that. So pushing on. So we have it to where Ben is ultimately seemingly like having a good time at this dance, doing dance montages and whatever, what have you. But eventually we find out that Charlie and Luke had the last dance, and Ben is looking at them going like, God, I'm never really going to truly win Charlie over, and it feels like she's just forced to be like consistently tied to me, and it's not fair to her. We ultimately have it to where Mason is ultimately mentioning like, man, like I wish that I could ultimately uh, get a necklace around my girlfriend or one of my girls, so ultimately like I can be together with them forever, kind of thing. And we have it to where Ben's like, yeah, that's great. And ultimately, we have it to where Mason leaves. Ultimately, realizing how, like, Charlie is, like, balled and chained to Ben. And so we have it to where Ben is trying to do the right thing for Charlie. And so we have it to where Ben mentions to Charlie that the whole distance thing was all a lie, was all a ruse. And told me if they go more than 30 feet from one another, he'll be perfectly fine, which is a lie. So we ultimately end up having Charlie ending up going and walking further away from 30 feet. Because we have to where Charlie is actually really having real, true, legitimate feelings for Ben, ultimately fantasizing about dreaming about Ben and sleeping with Ben or kissing Ben or doing things in the end with Ben. For some reason, I just don't quite understand why. Because I would have thought that Charlie would have been even more so like having feelings for Luke. Um, Ultimately, it kind of feels like the Charlie and Ben feelings where like Charlie's really infatuated with Ben doesn't actually make sense to me, but it's just like, well, the like really we have it to where it just has to be this way because of story. So we end up having it to where Charlie is ultimately just angry and or upset that Ben has kind of betrayed her and lied to her and all kinds of things. And so ultimately we have it to where Charlie is to go more than 30 feet, and Ben says it doesn't hurt, but then eventually when she walks even further, Ben collapses off of pain. So we end up having it to where Charlie is to ultimately go anyways and talk to seemingly a woman called Madam something. Trying to scroll down, Madam Fortuna, and so ultimately we have it to where Madam Fortuna is ultimately seemingly a fortune teller of sorts that ultimately had given people this necklace prior. We ultimately find out that seemingly Madame Fortuna ultimately is seemingly clung to a man called Jasper, ultimately seemingly in a gas mask or gas mask medical mask like apparatus, ultimately needing to figure out how to breathe. It seems that Jasper is ultimately a guy that is seemingly on his way to quite possibly passing away at some point. And so we end up finding out that Madame Fortuna ultimately is to talk to Charlie and to mention that ultimately she herself is actually a zombie. And so we have it to where Madame ultimately wipes the part of her makeup to showcase that she is actually a zombie. And we find out that ultimately Madame had been tied to Jasper, and ultimately when he dies, she assumes that she is going to die as well because it's a love connection kind of thing. So we end up having it to where Charlie is trying to get all of the information from Madam about this whole entire thing, and if there's a way to break the curse or anything like that. And we ultimately have it to where Madam is just like, well, no, not really. And if anything, we have it to where Madam ultimately mentions about the distance thing, and ultimately, like, a person needs to be staying as close to one another as humanly possible. And Charlie is like, so what? So that was a legitimate thing? And ultimately, we have it to where Madam is like, well, yeah, like, how far away are you from Ben? And she's like, well, yeah, like, we've been, like, way distantly away from one another for seemingly 2 days. And Madam's like, oh my god, we have no time to lose. So ultimately, we have it to where Madam and Charlie are to make their way to Ben. And unfortunately, Ben is seemingly a real zombie of sorts because ultimately he is just kind of like like he is just like his lip is just kind of blown up and swollen, and all kinds of weird looking, like his eyes are white. And ultimately they were scrambling to try to find Charlie somewhere in the school, and we found out that Charlie had been in standing up somewhere. And so we seemingly have it to where, and here's the thing, we have an officer that is supposed to be following Charlie around, or following Ben around, and why is it that this officer didn't know where Ben was? I'm confused. But I guess that's just whatever. So we end up having it to where Charlie is to find Ben, and ultimately Ben is unresponsive and all kinds of things. And so we eventually have it to where Charlie is thinking, like, well, like, what should I do? Like, how should I help him? Like, why isn't that, like, considering, like, we're close to one another, shouldn't he be normal again? And ultimately, Madam's like, gee, golly, I don't know. We ultimately have it to where people are mentioning it's like, well, if you believe in fairy tales, maybe you should kiss him and maybe that'll work out. Like, maybe it's a kiss, maybe true love will cure the, like, dude, this isn't like Beauty and the Beast. Like, this isn't Beauty and the Beast. This isn't like Sleeping Beauty. Um, but anyway, so Charlie ends up kissing Ben anyways, and she gets a little remnants of disgusting all up in her lips. And we end up having it to where seemingly there seems to be no cure for Ben. So ultimately, we have to where Charlie ultimately is like, how about me and Charlie just have, or me and Ben just have some alone time? And we have it to where everybody leaves, and we have it to where Charlie is confessing like every little thing about Ben, like talking about old times and all kinds of things. And it seems that ultimately, like these two are sitting at this couch, and it seems to be that the camera is ultimately getting closer and closer onto Charlie. And I'm like, okay, so something's gonna happen to Ben, and because basically he's getting closer and closer to be out of camera, so something is going to happen. Like, you don't do a camera angle this way for nothing to happen. That would be stupid. And then, plus, I feel like there has to be a bizarrely happy ending out of all this. So, we end up having it to where ultimately Charlie's talking about old times, reminiscing, and ultimately talking about every little thing about her and Ben and this and that. And we have to have it happen to where Ben ultimately comes back miraculously to life. Like, he doesn't become back into being a real boy or anything like that, which I'm assuming that's probably what the next season is probably going to be. Like, how can we get Ben from being dead to back alive? Because ultimately that's what we need to do. So, ultimately we have it to where Ben miraculously comes back alive, and we have it to where ultimately Charlie is mentioning about that she had kissed Ben, and like all the stuff that had happened to lead them up to this point. Because we have it to where Ben is like, well, yeah, I have no clue about what was going on, what was happening, like. So we end up having Charlie mentioning to Ben what all she had done to this lead up, and so we have it to where Ben ultimately is just like, well, I'm so sad that ultimately I wasn't able to actually be coherent when you kissed me. I think that this is awful. This sucks. And ultimately to where Charlie has to repetitiously kiss Ben, ultimately still cementing their relationship, even though Ben is a zombie who ultimately at some point might decompose, because you don't know. Or at some point he can just eat the flesh off of people at a certain point. I'm assuming that that hopefully is going to happen at some point. Because ultimately, we also have it to where Ben didn't scratch anybody. I thought that that would have been really funny if they would have gone in and had Ben accidentally scratch somebody, and then ultimately people were to assume that that other person was going to be a zombie, and would have had to have closely watched them to see if they were going to become a zombie or not. And then ultimately, when that person doesn't, then ultimately just like, nah, well, I guess we'll be fine. But no, they never do anything like that. But anyways, yeah, a lot of this is a rush just to get this review done, to be brutally honest. There's really not a lot going on, to be brutally honest. And a lot of the show is just really just kind of a very much formulaic or kind of predictable show. And because recently I was thinking, I'm like, oh, well, like, we're going to do the I Love You, Beth Cooper thing, where ultimately Charlie is going to end up with Ben in the end. And so recently that's immediately what I was thinking the entire time. But we have to have it to where Luke is also this, like it's kind of Tristan in his old kind of, where we have it to where Charlie and Ben has had this history, but eventually Luke comes in there with his good looks and ultimately tries to win Charlie over, but the history between Charlie and Ben went over in the end. So going with this, like, recently, just kind of it ends in kind of a happy ending, and so everybody goes off on their own paths to ultimately just decide to otherwise just say, hey, yeah, like, girl and zombie still working it out. All right, like, it'll be kind of interesting to see where this eventual relationship goes on further. But at the end of the day, I don't know if I want to watch any more of this. If there are going to be more, or if there was, I don't know. I only saw the first season, and I didn't know if I was going to go any further on into that. So, anyways, I'm going to get out of my way to get out of here. So, goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.